Art, are there limits to scientific knowledge? Are there questions that science will never address?
Yeah, so I think that there are limits. And in fact, this is a big question. There's a famous Oxford medical scientist who won the Nobel Prize, Peter Medawar, who was himself an atheist, who wrote a famous little book called The Limits of Science in 1987. Highly recommend that you read. And he said that there is a limit to science is made very likely by the kinds of questions that science can never ask. These are the questions that children ask, or he said, questions like, why am I here, and what's the purpose of life, and how should I live? And he said it's not the science, but the metaphysics and religion and imaginative literature that we should look for these things. He also said, the fact that there's a limit on science doesn't mean that somehow something is wrong with science. Rather, asking these kinds of questions of science is like asking a locomotive to fly or do something else that it was never designed for. He said it more beautifully than I say it now. And I think what he meant was this: science, limits itself to particular kinds of questions, mechanistic questions, questions of how things are. The question of is the universe significant or not is a religious question to a large extent. It cannot be answered by science. Science, it might give us some hints towards it. So the fact that the universe is very rich and fertile and beautiful suggests that it's more likely to be purposeful, perhaps. But it doesn't tell us whether it's purposeful or not. If there's nothing, I think, if there is nothing but atoms and molecules in the naturalistic world, then perhaps it's true that there is also nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And so, but if there is a God behind the world, then perhaps there is something of purpose beyond it. But these are questions that science can't and cannot answer. And I think so it's true that science expands all the time in what it can answer. It can help you answer things, but I think that there are fundamental limits. Let me give you one example, if you don't mind. So it's kind of a cool example, but I think it's helpful to think this through. So I would even go as far as to say that many of the most important decisions that you make in life cannot be answered by science. So let me give you an example. So who in this room is not married? All right, look around, everybody. Okay, right. Just joking. So if you, let's say you want to get married, that's an incredibly important decision that you'll make in life. And one of the questions is that amenable to the scientific methods? And also, is the alternative, therefore, irrationality? Well, the fact is, if you were to go and grab the first person that you saw raise their hand and say, marry me, that would be a truly irrational thing to do. And if the person says yes, that's even more irrational. So what you do is you get to know somebody that you like, you get to see whether you're compatible or not. You do, in fact, my wife and I, before we got married, did these kind of compatibility tests where you see whether there's things that are similar, where you squeeze a toothpaste and all those kinds of things. And we found out, for example, that neither of us has ever owned a TV, which actually turns out to be important in life, because if you're married, those are things that do matter. And that's where science can help you make that decision. But at the end of the day, you can't use the scientific methods to, for example, get scientific certainty that this is the person you ought to marry. If I'd wanted to do that, if I'd wanted to do that, I would have probably waited forever. And the reason for that is because, and you also don't do repeatable experiments in marriage, it's not a good idea. And so, it doesn't really work, does it? And one of the fundamental reasons for that is this: you don't know what it's like to be married until you've made that step. You make a step of faith. There is evidence that you cannot see until you're married. Many decisions in life have that character. There are things that you don't know about them until you're in them. So you have to take a leap of faith. You can take a irrational leap of faith or a well-reasoned leap of faith, but it's always going to be a kind of leap of faith. And so I think if you insist on using the scientific methods for adjudicating whether you love somebody, if you use the hermeneutic of suspicion to say, I don't really believe this until I see evidence for it, there's evidence you'll never see. And so I think it makes you, it doesn't mean that science can't help you, these compatibility tests are helpful, but fundamentally, this kind of decision and many other decisions you make in your life are not and will never be amenable to the scientific method. And if you think that it does, then you'll be an impoverished human being. So.